He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Hi, Caroline. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Yes, how are you?
Oh, stupid question to ask a hypochondriac, I suppose.
Well, it depends how detailed an answer you want.
You're listening to Kim Hill Wants to Know, hosted by me, Kim Hill. The more we know about things, the more there is to worry about things going wrong. This is especially true of our bodies, where, if you think too hard about it, it seems impossible that something isn't going wrong now, and now, and now. And is this normal, Doctor?
The idea of your own mortality can be very, what's the word? It can be very cheerful in a way. I know that sounds...
Is that the best word you could come up with? Hypochondria. Caroline Crampton likes the word, even though, as she says, her fears about her health are persistent and at times intrusive. They are not necessarily unwarranted. She's been diagnosed with cancer once already, at the age of 17, and had it recur, to the surprise of the experts. But what might once have been a proportionate level of anxiety has settled into something all of its own.
I anticipated that I would be on the receiving end of more stigma myself.
That's right. Pull yourself together. Pull yourself together, Caroline. Caroline's book, A Body Made of Glass, is a history of hypochondria. She says it took a long time for her to even entertain the idea that she might be a hypochondriac. The first thing that you can sort out for me, Caroline, is that thanks to your etymological analysis, I now understand why it's hypochondria, which always seemed counterintuitive to me because hypo means low or under, right?
Yes, so the word is made up of two Greek words originally, hupo, as you say, meaning under, and chondros, which means cartilage or ribs. And it's a reference to the fact that the word in its most original form referred to a specific part of the body, the bit under the ribs. So that's where it came from. It's almost like a set of geographical coordinates.
And so to begin with, the word referred to a part of the body, nothing to do with the mind.
That's right, yes. So the hypochondrion is what it roughly translates to in English. And hypochondria, any condition arising from that part of the body. It was the bit just under the ribs where the liver and the spleen reside. That was the area of the body that Greeks in the 5th century BC, like Hippocrates, would point to if you asked them to show you their hypochondria.
And slowly, as you describe in the book, it moved from a description of the body to something that was entirely lodged in the mind. How did that journey happen?
It's mostly via the connection that region of the body developed with something called melancholy. And for this, we have to go a little bit into the theory of the four humours, which was the dominant theory for understanding the way the body worked for about 2,000 years. And in that theory, you've got four humours, which are these sort of figurative liquids that make up the stuff of human life. You've got blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And in every human body, these four things need to be in perfect balance for perfect health to be achieved. And if there's an excess or a deficit of any one, then that's what causes illnesses. And there's a very complicated schedule of what the different problems that could be caused by the different imbalances.
In
but
fact,
that area of the body...
I was just going to interrupt to say that the word melancholy came from the words for black bile.
Yes, exactly. Melancholy, melon, black, cola, bile. And so it was an excess of black bile which caused melancholy, and black bile was thought to be produced by the liver, which resided in this hypochondria area. and it was an excess of, so the connection between that part of the body and the condition of melancholy was established very early on. And so you get these very early case reports from the likes of Hippocrates talking about the mental symptoms suffered by people with what were thought to be physical conditions of that area of the body. And so that link between the physical and the mental is established very early on. And then over the successive 1,000 years, very gradually that theory of the four humours is superseded by better science, better understandings of how the human body really works. But the association between the word hypochondria and the condition of doubt and depression and anxiety that went with melancholy remains. And there's a period in sort of the 1500s, 1600s when the two sort of coexist. You get writings from people like Robert Burton, who wrote this famous book called The Anatomy of Melancholy. And at his point, you sort of see both. He talks about physical symptoms in that area of the body and arising from it, but he's also talking very clearly about mental health in connection with these. And then after him, the physical stuff recedes. It's no longer associated, but the connection between hypochondria and anxiety remains strong. So that's how you get this very old word that has completely transformed in meaning over the very long period.
You mentioned Burton. He was a hypochondriac, was he?
I think we would call him so today, yes. They weren't using that word in his time to mean what we now mean it. But he was definitely suffering from melancholy. He had been, quote, officially diagnosed with that. And I think from what he describes of his symptoms, you would call it depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and a very heavy preoccupation with his physical health.
A lot of the famous people that you talk about in your book had good reason to be concerned about their health. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, for example, was stricken with quite disabling symptoms, pains in the head and the back and loss of mobility. And Philip Larkin was, you say, a lifelong hypochondriac who was convinced that he would die at the same age as his father, 63, and indeed did. And so there seems to be, as you describe it, a very good reason always, maybe always, to be concerned about your health. It's not all in the mind.
Yes, it's a very interesting circle, this, and one that I definitely don't have the answer to, is did Larkin die at that age because there was something already in his body predestining him not to outlive his father? Or did he die at the same age as his father because he had mentally decided that that's what was going to happen? You see this in a few different cases. Robert Burton actually is another example. He, when he was quite young, an astrologer did a horoscope of his whole life for him, which predicted the year and I think even the month of his death. And lo and behold, he died in that month, in that year. And it feels too coincidental, doesn't it, for that to keep happening to people with these preoccupations. So what I started to wonder is, actually, can the anxiety cause these problems or at least contribute to them? And although I can't point to any definitive clinical trial or anything that proves that, I think what we know so far about the impact of the mind upon the body would suggest that there could be something there. You know, we already know that stress, for instance, has a very detrimental effect on our health, and contributes to the development of various physical ailments. So if someone has a very fixed idea about illness, it doesn't seem that wild that it could, in fact, contribute to it coming about. Yes, I became very interested in whether hypochondriacs are, in fact, thinking themselves ill in addition to their concerns.
Of course, and that, oh, wow. And then you're in a real anxiety loop, right? I mean, talking about you, the radiation and chemotherapy used to treat your Hodgkin lymphoma could make other cancers more likely. And so that might play
Yes,
on your
absolutely.
mind. And if you already think that what is in your mind can affect your body, then hey presto. But are you a hypochondriac or are you somebody with reasonable concerns?
Well, this is, I think, the unanswerable question because
Yes.
throughout history, we've drawn that line of reasonable or justified concerns extremely subjectively. It's been applied differently for different people at different times. And I mean, I even think today that, if I went to see 10 different psychiatrists, I might get 10 different answers about that. Um, it's we're at this point where sort of science fails us or can't offer us any certainties, and we're in the realm of subjective determination, really. And this was something that I spent a lot of time exploring when I was writing the book, because I think when you get into the area of theory around this, because hypochondria is an idea that's been quite interesting to philosophers over the centuries. And when you read more abstract theoretical works about it, you come across this figure of the hypochondriac, who is someone who is perfectly healthy. There is absolutely nothing wrong with them. And yet they are obsessed with their, perception that their body is failing around them. But in real life, I don't know if such a person really exists. The more I've looked into it, the more I think that everyone has some claim to justifiable anxiety, whether it's as in my case, I have this serious pre-existing condition and had all these harmful treatments for it, which I now receive monitoring for, which in turn can have side effects of its own. Or it might be something like an environmental factor. Maybe someone's very anxious about potential asthma and they live in an area of high air pollution, for instance. That seems like a justifiable anxiety. There are, or even these days, all of the genetic testing and so on that we can do. If you have some genetic results come back saying that you are very likely or in a high risk group for a certain condition and you have anxiety around developing that, again, that doesn't seem that unreasonable. So I've come to realize that I think this figure of the perfectly healthy hypochondriac with no justifiable reasons for concern, yet who is obsessed with their own illness, I'm not sure that they exist. I think we all exist somewhere on a continuum of this stuff, and you move from greater or lesser likelihood at different points in your life.
It depends how suggestible we are as well. I mean, when I was 4 years old, a ball hit me in the stomach. Somebody kicked a ball. And for some reason, I picked up on the concept, which might have been at large at the time, that a blow to the stomach can cause cancer. And I became convinced that I was going to develop cancer of the stomach for what seems like quite a long time. Obviously, a 4-year-old is quite suggestible. And now I don't think that because I never got cancer of the stomach. But do you think that the more we know, the more we worry?
Do you think there is an extent to that? Yes. I had a somewhat related childhood incident where I ate a dessert off a menu. My family was traveling in Germany, and all of the menu items were in German, and I just picked something. And then my father told me what it meant, and the name of the dessert was Death by Chocolate. And then I spent the whole night lying there awake. I think I was about 6, convinced that I was going to die because I'd eaten this dessert that was called Death by Chocolate. And why would they call it that if it wasn't going to kill you? So, yes, I do think that there is an element of naivety, suggestibility that can, make you more vulnerable to these things. But then, yes, also, I think when you look at the patterns of hypochondria through history, people don't dread having illnesses that they don't know exist. It goes in cycles and fashions. When you look at what people in the 18th century were worried about versus the 19th, 20th, 21st, it's different. It reflects whatever the high profile medical anxieties are of the day. So there's definitely a sense in which it's environmental, as it were. It's coming from the information that you've imbibed, as opposed to something innate from within you.
The title of your book, A Body Made of Glass, is a very clever title because it is metaphorical in a number of ways. Tell me about the first meaning you ascribed to it, the strange belief hundreds of years ago that one's body was in fact made of glass. I don't know how widespread it was. You've got a couple of examples, fairly high-ranking people who we would now describe them as unhinged, would we not?
Yes, so there are quite good records of this thing called the glass delusion cropping up from around the 1400s onwards, in which sufferers from it began seemingly spontaneously to believe that part or the whole of their body was made of glass. And it manifested itself particularly in this excessive anxiety that they were going to break or shatter because they were made of glass. Probably the most high-profile person known to have suffered from this was the French King Charles VI, who quite unusually did think his entire body was made of glass. Apparently it was more common to have one glass limb or a glass head, or some people thought they had a glass heart inside them, that sort of thing. But Charles VI thought he was wholly made of glass, and he wore reinforced clothing to try and keep him safe, and he became paranoid about anyone touching him in case he broke. But there are examples. Even there was a documented case in the Netherlands in the 1960s where a man thought he was made of glass. But interestingly, because glass as a material has become very strong, we build entire buildings out of it now. His preoccupation was less about the fragility of the glass than with the transparency. He was convinced that people could see through him, that he was invisible because he was made of glass, less worried that he was going to break. So yes, this has been going on for centuries. It's a very, very niche, minor psychological problem, with some traces even before that. In the 2nd century AD, there are records of people suffering from what's called the earthenware delusion, which is thinking that they were made of pottery or ceramic, and then it becomes glass when that becomes a well-known material.
So interesting.
It is, isn't it?
The evolution, the historical evolution of metaphor.
Exactly. You can see how there's something conceptual about breakability and fragility that is then being expressed through the material that people know of. I don't know whether maybe at some point in the distant future it will be something else,
yes,
because there'll be some other new material. So I found that idea fascinating as something deep inside the human psyche that is concerned with fragility. And as well as just being a really interesting historical phenomenon, this delusion seemed to me to be a really good image for how it feels to have hypochondria or anxiety about your health, that you feel fragile, you feel breakable, you feel vulnerable, but only you can perceive that it's not obvious to anyone else. To everyone else, you just look completely fine.
The other way the title works, of course, is that you mentioned genetic testing. We've got MRI. More and more, our bodies are able to be seen as if they were transparent, as if they were made of glass.
Yes, exactly. So I recount in the book this sensation I had during an MRI scan, that it was temporarily turning me into a body made of glass because it was able to see within me and find out all of this information about what was going on inside me that even I don't know. And so, yes, I thought it was also a good way of thinking about the way modern medicine and science interacts with the body, and the body as both this, for want of a more graceful phrase, as a kind of lump of meat to be examined, but then also obviously the body has a kind of figurative sense in our mind. It's part of our sense of self and how we understand our personality, and all of that being exposed to inquiry seemed to me like a very a process of becoming transparent.
I'm interested in your embrace of the word hypochondriac when it comes to yourself, because if one is a hypochondriac, surely one wouldn't identify as one. Do you know what I mean? It's it's
Yes,
is
I
it
do.
not saying, look, I know it's not real, but nevertheless I believe it. Huh?
Yes, there is something fundamentally contradictory about it, but I think most people will have experienced that for themselves. For instance, knowing that they are perfectly safe in a situation, but still feeling gnawing anxiety that something's about to jump out from behind a tree, that kind of thing. That you can hold both things in your head at the same time. And that, I think, is what this feels like for me, is that I am well educated about my health and science and the probabilities of various things involved. That can all be true. And I can also have this less rational, less organized feeling, dread that something is wrong that the aforementioned science hasn't yet come across.
Right.
Because everyone who has, had a serious diagnosis remembers the time before the meeting with the doctor where you already had it, you just didn't know. And so that's the sort of situation that you're imagining all the time, I think.
You described this photograph that was taken of you when you were 16, 17, and before you were diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And when you see the photograph, you can see the lump,
Yes.
but you had no idea at that point that you were ill. This must haunt you.
Yes, it does. I mean, that's absolutely the visual representation of what I mean, that you can see in that photograph that it's there, but I didn't know it was there because it had grown so slowly that it just seemed like part of me, I suppose. I suppose the part that's a bit less forgivable, understandable, is that nobody else noticed it or did anything about it. I remember very vividly, there was a friend of a friend whose mother was a doctor. And I remember when my friend found out about the diagnosis and so on, she said, "Oh yeah, my friend Charlotte, whose mum's a doctor, she did ask me whether you knew about that lump in your neck, but I just assumed that you must do." And so I didn't say anything. And thinking back on it, I was like, yeah, maybe someone could have said something to me.
Yes.
Maybe that would have been a good idea. But nobody did. And I don't know how normal that is. I don't know whether, other people with cancer or similar conditions will have stories like that or not. I haven't heard any others like it, so maybe it's a bit of an anomaly. But that's the perfect encapsulation of what I'm talking about, is that I had this even quite obvious visual sign that something was wrong for a number of months, and just coexisted with it, having absolutely no idea that it was there. And so I think that's what my anxiety particularly is harking back to, is what if I'm living in the before of the before and after right now? I think is what I'm thinking.
And that's as good a reason for hypervigilance as any. But this is reinforced, of course, by the fact that after your first treatment for Hodgkin's lymphoma, everybody said, no, that's done and dusted, you're sorted now. And it came back. And so consequently, you must feel as if you have always to be alert to anything. And as you say, the experts can yet be surprised.
Yes. So, I mean, no one said definitively, uh, you know, this will definitely get it with the first round of treatment. What the doctor said was 95% of people your age and at your stage are sorted out by this treatment. And then, of course, I was in the 5% that were not. Um, so I suppose I've become a bit mistrustful of that kind of reassurance via probability, because there's no reason why I should be in one group rather than the other. But also, I think the idea that I think I can't remember if I say this in the book or not, but it was discussed afterwards. Did it come back, or had it in fact never gone away? I think there was some question about whether the scan that had sort of given me the quote all clear, was that in fact, had that been misinterpreted? And I suppose it doesn't matter either way. But I suppose what that did give me is some doubts about placing all of your faith in these tests, which are only the best that science has available for us at any given moment. I've talked to people who have had the same cancer as me 15 years on, and the type of treatment, type of testing that they have is completely different to what I had because, research has moved on and the treatment has improved immeasurably. And so we, I think, are encouraged to think of, and we encourage ourselves to think of all of these things as, scientific certainties and infallible, when in fact, all of it's just a work in progress.
I feel as if I'm going to have to put a trigger warning on this interview because the more you talk,
Yes.
the more you think that we're all made of glass, and at any moment something could strike us down.
Yes, so I suppose there's one of two ways you can follow that thought, really. On the one hand, you can spend every moment cowering in fear, or you can go the other way and say, well, something could strike me down at any moment. I definitely have a finite number of months or years left on this planet, so maybe I should just live and worry as little as possible. So that's the route that I have tried to take. And actually, the process of writing the book was oddly reassuring in that regard. I definitely would count myself as a less anxious person now, having written it, than I was before.
Really?
Having
Why?
really spent the time to clarify all these ideas. I think a few different reasons. One, that kind of really intense self-examination is very good for you, I think. I went to a lot of therapy during the writing of it, talked about a lot of these topics, which was very interesting. Also, the process of research really gave me a sense of appreciation for the human body and everything it does, both with and without our knowledge, which makes me a bit more able when my body does something unexpected, rather than reacting immediately with fear. That there is some part of me that's like, wow, that's all these millions of cells that I have no control of. Well, they just did that, didn't they? It gives me a slightly more balanced reaction. And then also, I think just really, really digging into the idea of your own mortality can be very what's the word? It can be very cheerful in a way. I know that sounds
Is that the best word you could come up with?
Yeah, well, just this idea that you are going to die one day, so enjoy yourself while you can, I suppose. I've been asked a few times in book events and so on about, do I have any recommendations for other people who experience this? And it's not a practical one, but I can recommend the process of writing a book about it, because that has been very beneficial for me.
Yeah. I'm very taken with an expression I've never been able to find the provenance of. Anxiety is a bird that will always find a branch to perch on. And my question is, had you never had Hodgkin's lymphoma, would you have been, I don't know what the word is, obsessed with something else? Would you be a hypochondriac, whatever happened, or was that a trigger for you?
It's a really interesting idea. My best theory is that I think I would have developed a different kind of anxiety. For instance, I remember being in my early teens, maybe, and my family was flying somewhere. I think maybe we're going to visit my grandparents in South Africa. And, it was a big long haul flight, and my father almost missed the flight. He, was parking the car, couldn't get a shuttle to the terminal. And I just remember like standing in the entrance of the airport, like sort of visibly vibrating with my anxiety that he was going to miss this flight, and running through the airport. And so I think it's quite possible that had the Hodgkin's lymphoma not come along, that something else would have happened to give me an outlet for this tendency. So maybe I would have become someone who was, terrified of flights and airports, or maybe I would have become terrified of heights or something else. But yeah, I do think that it was just something looking for a way out.
And so hypochondria is just another form of anxiety. So why has it got such a special place in the procession of anxieties?
I think it is fascinating to us now and has been to our predecessors for centuries past because of what it represents about the connection between mind and body. Just being anxious about travel or something exists only in the mind, whereas there are well documented cases of people having visible symptoms. The most common in history are, stomach issues were very digestive problems, very associated with hypochondria. Robert Burton refers to what he calls windy melancholy, which listeners can interpret for themselves what that means. But that's we can all tell that that's happening, and yet it's all stemmed just from his mind. It's all just from what's happening in his head. I think that's the source of the fascination, is this idea that our imperceptible thoughts can cause perceptible manifestations of something in the body.
And as we know now, that's true. The more we know about the microbiome, for example. And Hippocrates said all disease begins in the gut. And we've come full circle in a way.
Yes, absolutely. That there is now beginning to be some really interesting research on the fact that what you eat and how you eat and when you eat has immeasurable impacts on other parts of your body. And I think we already know just from anecdotally how we feel. For instance, I've quite recently been on this effort to try and eliminate some of the bad ultra processed food from my diet. I know I feel better when I'm not eating it. And I feel better in ways that have seemingly nothing to do with my digestive system, and yet it's quite easy to find the connection between the two things. So yes, I think they may not have had the techniques to prove it, but 2,500 years ago, Hippocrates was onto the right thing.
Although we can have psychosomatic illness, we can also have psychosomatic health, presumably.
Psychosomatic health in what sense?
Well, it may not be making you actually better by cutting out ultra-processed foods from your diet, but if you think that it might be making you better, then it probably will make you better.
I mean, yes, the placebo effect is very well documented.
Yeah, well,
the idea that you can take a sugar pill, and as long as you're told that it's a drug. And in fact, there is, I think I quoted this in the book, there's some evidence that even when people are told that what they're being given is not a real drug, there is still some benefit perceived for it, which is extraordinary.
It is
But yes,
extraordinary. That makes no sense to me. I don't understand it. Is it like, no, I don't understand that. Do you?
I think it's the particular, if I remember rightly, the particular trial that they had that in, it was still, people were still participating in a clinical trial at a hospital, and they were still being given the pills by doctors. But the doctors were saying, you are receiving a blank pill here. I think it was the context, and I think this is my theory, the idea that because I think people participating in a trial have a reasonable understanding that they can be told things for the purposes of the trial that may not be true. So I wonder if there was an effect like, they're telling me this is a blank, but maybe it isn't. In the same way that I might be told that it is a drug, but it's not. All this kind of stuff for the purposes of research. So I think it was the context of the clinical trial, perhaps, that was operating on people's brains, rather than the specific words that they were being told, if that makes sense. So yes, I do think that if you believe that something is going to help you, there is a stronger chance that it will.
Is it for the first time in human history that health is now no longer not being ill, but is something we can all aspire to no matter who we are. Do you know what I mean?
I think so, yes. I think health used to be the state of not being ill, and now it's become its own journey, its own sort of spectrum. That it's not enough just so, like, for instance, by the old definition, I am perfectly healthy. I'm not currently under treatment or observation by any doctors for any known conditions. But I could still be healthier, is what our contemporary culture tells me. I could still eat better. I could still exercise more. I could still feel better. I could sleep more, all of these things. So, yes, as far as I understand it, for the first time, we've now made health into a sort of journey to progress through as opposed to just the absence of illness.
And this is what's called the wellness industry, I suppose, which you link in the book to a kind of upsurge of quackery in the 18th century. What caused that?
A few different things. The main one, historians think, is this the other movements that were going on at that time, where people were becoming less absolutist about their religion. Society was becoming more individual. The idea of consumerism was on the rise. I found some really interesting discussions of the fact that until that time, most people would have expected to make all of their own household goods. You know, if you needed soap, you would make it, or you would buy it from someone very local who you knew made it, that kind of thing. Suddenly the idea that you would provide all of your own remedies and medicine ceased to be the case. Now you go to a shop, perhaps in a town, to a specialist, etc., etc. And so a market for that explodes. So all of these different societal changes and forces were all intersecting at the same time, and also total lack of any kind of proper regulation of what medicine is and isn't enables all kinds of blurry grey areas to flourish. And you get a peak of it in the 18th century, and then you get another one in the 19th century, but that one is more around vanity and appearance. So it's more about tonics to make your hair thicker and your skin clearer, as opposed to specifically health related. And I think that was a reflection of, society was becoming more appearance driven. So yes, I think that was very interesting. And I think you can put today's wellness industry in that same context. The advent of the smartphone camera has done for our perceptions of ourselves, what all of these wearable tech devices like wristwatches that track your heart rate and rings that can tell how long you've slept for, what that does to your consumerist impulses to try and buy things to make yourself feel better. I think, again, that's why we're seeing a resurgence of an old idea.
It's another sense of a body made of glass. Of course, you find out how you slept when you wake up in the morning. How do you feel about all that? Do you do that stuff?
I have. And I have in the past, and I've now got rid of it all because I decided that it was not good for me. Because having all of that data really allowed me to fixate on what might be wrong with me.
It wasn't reassuring.
It wasn't reassuring. And it goes back to what you were saying before, I think, about can too much knowledge actually make you worse? I think in that sense, it was too much knowledge for me. I do better with less information.
Yeah.
I'm less likely to spiral if I just don't have a reason to think about it too much.
But also, I mean, clearly I'm not a member of that particular health club. The modern wellness industry and all these monitoring devices that we can wear to, test our blood pressure at any particular time, it just reeks of self-obsession. And that's very judgmental of me to say. How would you say it?
I think it's like a lot of these things that there's a kind of subjective zone to it. I think up to a point, you could argue that someone's just being a responsible patient. Maybe they are taking their own blood pressure so as to not take up appointments at the doctor's to have it done. That they're doing it from that kind of motivation. But then there is a point at which it does tip over into just being completely fixated on your own bodily wellness and spending a lot of time maintaining and talking about it. And at that point, you might think, maybe look outside beyond yourself for your amusement rather than within. But yes, I think I experienced a bit of this with I feel like when I was finished with cancer treatment and when I had several years of kind of annual checkups and then I was discharged, no longer needing them. And I was told by the doctors, keep an eye on everything. If you have any doubts, come straight in. We want you. You are the first line of defense. You'll notice something before anyone else does.
Oh,
All this
no,
kind of stuff.
no pressure.
Yeah. So this was all of that was like, this is responsible patienthood, is how it was sold to me. Like this is
Yes.
you being responsible. So in one sense, all that monitoring I was being told is a good thing. That's what I should be doing. And then much later, when I'm, looking into cognitive behavioral therapy for hypochondria and health anxiety, suddenly they're saying all of the monitoring and hypervigilance is a bad thing, that this is a manifestation of the anxiety. And which is it? I think is the answer will be different depending on who you ask. So this is why I kind of incline to the view that it's quite hard to make hard and fast statements about this stuff, really.
The therapy that you mentioned earlier, was that cognitive behavioural therapy that helped you?
Yes. Yeah, so I had a few different things. Yes, CBT, and then also I did something called EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing is what it stands for.
Yeah, it's the very fast movement of the eyes from side to side. Why does that work? Or why do people believe that works?
So the theory is that, and this is a theory that was mostly developed in research with military veterans suffering PTSD from war zones, who were experiencing things like sort of a feeling of numbness in a limb or incapacitating back pain or something, but there was no physical reason for them to be doing so. No scans could turn up any herniated discs or anything like that. And the idea was that they were holding on to the trauma of what they'd experienced in the field, and it was expressing itself in a physical way because they weren't allowing themselves to think about these memories. And so the theory of EMDR is that you're storing these memories in a certain part of the brain, which is kind of the short-term memory for remembering things that have happened recently, and that the moving your eyes back and forth whilst talking about and reflecting on these memories helps you move them to a different part of the brain where we store longer term memories. So basically, we are kind of archiving these memories. We still know that these things happened, but we're no longer kind of re-experiencing them constantly, that we're moving them into the past. That's the theory.
I wonder if these things have been available to Proust, whether we would have had remembrance of things lost. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, you do wonder. Yes, absolutely. No, I do think that his art certainly was about the circularity of memory and the dwelling on and embroidering things every time they're thought about. Yeah, it is interesting. Having done it myself, I remain, I would say, partially skeptical about it. But I can also say that it worked for me in the sense that there were aspects of medical treatment that I found very traumatic that I now no longer have kind of nightmares where I wake up screaming about them. And it stopped the day that I did that sort of thing. I'm still unclear whether that was actually the EMDR or the fact that I was doing something about it, that kind of placebo feeling that, well, I'm doing a treatment, therefore it will work. I don't know. But either way, the outcome was good.
When you talk to people about your book, do people identify with what you describe? Are you unearthing a whole lot of people who now call themselves hypochondriacs?
I've definitely had that response. Yes, people saying that they very much recognize some aspect of their own experience in what I described. It's an interesting transition, I think, for people, because when you are initially in this, you don't think, oh, I've got hypochondria. You think, oh, I'm having a heart attack. Oh, I've got this condition. Oh, I've got this condition. That's how it presents to your mind. And it can take quite a long time for you to be able to step back and see the pattern. I interviewed a few doctors about this, and they said, it's one of the most fraught things that I do in a consultation is having to say to someone, you've been here for these various things, we've done these different tests and we found nothing wrong. I think we need to consider that there's some underlying mental condition connecting all of these things rather than a series of coincidentally unrelated physical problems that I can't find any evidence for. And fraught because people can take that amiss. They can, reflecting on the very long history of stigmatization of mental health in general, and this one in particular, where people have been told that they're making it up or they're time wasting or they're being selfish or something. They can think that a doctor saying that is a dismissal. They're saying, I don't take you seriously.
Yeah.
Even if the doctor is, I interviewed some really very compassionate practitioners who were saying, I'm not saying that it's not serious. I'm just saying that we need to look for a mental rather than a physical explanation for what's going on with you. But it's entirely understandable that someone can have that reaction. So yes, it's been interesting, the response to the book. I anticipated there would be more, that I would be on the receiving end of more stigma myself.
That's right. Pull yourself together. Pull yourself together, Caroline.
Yeah, I assumed there would be a proportion of that in either reviews or in conversations I had with readers, but actually there's been none at all, which is pleasantly surprising.
I think it's the way you've written it. It's so interesting in its historical context. And of course you bring your own personal experience to bear on it, and you're clearly a serious and intelligent person. This is not the image that most people have of hypochondriacs, which is a word of dismissal still, isn't it?
It is, yes. And I explain a bit in the book about why I quite like that word and why I'm happy to use it about myself. It's mostly just because I like the connection to the history that it provides. And I also find that it's the one that everybody understands. Modern medicine prefers these days to say health anxiety or illness anxiety, in part to move away from the stigmatized history of hypochondria. I'm not sure that just changing the word necessarily changes behavior. And just in general conversation over the years that I was working on the book, it was when I said I'm working on a history of hypochondria that people understood what I meant. So that's why I like the word, because it just feels like it's easier to communicate with people about it. But yes, I absolutely think that it's a word with a fraught history, but then so are lots of other words that we use in medicine. Sort of papering over the history doesn't mean that it's not there.
One of your occupations, besides being an author, is a podcast called She Done It, which focuses on detective novels, most of them by women, in the earlier part of the 20th century. And I wondered if there was any link between that. Do you find those reassuring in some way?
Yeah, so there's two connections really. One is that the particular period of detective fiction that I cover on the podcast, which is the period between the First and Second World Wars, colloquially known as the Golden Age of detective fiction, it's been called a literature of convalescence. The idea being that it developed at that time because vast swathes of the population were extremely traumatized by their experiences of the First World War, and they were just in the mood, in the right place for something comforting and that provided certainty. That's what detective fiction gives you, is the certainty that the story will have an ending, the murderer will be caught, the good people will be free to go about their lives again. And it's been connected with the similar rise in popularity at the same time of things like crosswords, the idea of just a pleasant engagement for the brain that isn't too challenging or too contradictory or difficult or left unresolved. You can complete the crossword, you can finish the detective novel.
Yeah.
So in that sense, yes, I think there's a connection there. I also found that there's quite a lot of hypochondriacs in that sort of detective fiction. Agatha Christie writes about a few different ones in her books, because the hypochondriac, as a person who is always going on about how they're ill and how, the food tastes a bit off, is a great character to put in a murder mystery, especially if then halfway through the book they drop dead of something that everyone had been telling them was all in their head. So yeah, there's quite a few, I think, correspondences. I made a whole episode about the hypochondriacs of detective fiction when the book came out earlier this year.
How interesting. And is it only in retrospect that you say to yourself, yes, it makes perfect sense that I was drawn to that period of detective fiction?
I mean, I definitely liked those books even before I got cancer, just enjoyed them in the way that anyone else does. But I think I did know there was a connection, because I had one period during my cancer treatment when I was hospitalized for quite a long time, and I had all these extremely unrealistic and highbrow ideas about what I was going to do with all of this